This is the Italian Navy's elite assault force, Komsubin. These men are the descendants of the world's first naval special operations unit, the Decima Flotilla Mass, a clandestine group that would achieve glory in the Second World War with a secret invention known as the human torpedo, which would carry out the most successful special operation of the war. Incredibly, the genesis of this project began not in the Second, but in the dying days of the First World War.
The real strength of that weapon was secrecy.
When one went off in our harbour with a big bang.
It was an unfortunate year. My father died and I was left to clear up the family home. And when I was clearing up a lot of things there, in one of the cupboards I found this blue picnic basket full of top secret naval documents. When I opened them, it was a most peculiar pile of papers because it referred to a thing called a human torpedo.
1866, and the ships of the world's navies still have sails, but a great change is in process. In that year, a British engineer, Robert Whitehead, invents a device that will change naval warfare forever: the torpedo. This is Whitehead's first torpedo, a remarkable design that has hardly changed in 150 years. He designed a delivery system for releasing it underwater and an internal mechanism which kept it at the correct depth. In this early photograph, British naval officers are learning the method of setting the depth, the knowledge of which was officially top secret. Whitehead's design for the torpedo was adopted by the British Navy in 1870, and soon all navies were to purchase the weapon, first for use in torpedo boats, and then by 1900 in another new invention, the submarine. The 20th century's wars were to prove that the torpedo, the devil's device as it was sometimes called, was a devastating weapon. In 1915, an Italian naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Raffaele Rossetti, conceived a different use for the torpedo. He imagined riding the torpedo into the enemy's harbour to attack its ships. Rossetti worked on the prototype and manufacture on his own initiative for 3 years, adapting the design of the standard Italian torpedo with 2 detachable warheads and guided by 2 men wearing diving suits. World War I was creeping to a weary conclusion, but on the 31st of October 1918, 11 days before the armistice, a motorboat slowly left the harbour of Venice. On board was Raffaele Rossetti and a brand new weapon, which was soon to be launched against an unsuspecting enemy. The target was the Austro-Hungarian naval base at Pola, and the new weapon was his manned underwater torpedo. This new device carried 2 men into the very heart of the enemy harbour, Rossetti at the front and Lieutenant Paolucci sitting behind him. They successfully attached a magnetic explosive charge to the hull of the Austrian battleship, the Viribus Unitis. It exploded at dawn with devastating force, and 15 minutes later the ship sank, taking its captain with it. Rossetti's remarkable achievement remained an Italian secret. 70 years later, the son of a British naval officer, Lieutenant Commander Hobson, discovered his father's top secret papers and saw a list of Italian names, which led him to contact the Italian naval attaché in London. It was the first time he had heard of the Decima Flotilla Mass and of one of their first recruits, then a young lieutenant, Gino Birindelli.
The Italian names I'd read out to him were part of the Italian Navy, a very special group who had done an incredible job during the Second World War. My story then began to take off because I went to Italy and I met Gino Birondelli.
I'm Admiral Birondelli. I was born January 1911, joined the Naval Academy in Leghorn in 1925. I was made a midshipman in 1930, and from then on I was on board various Italian ships.
In 1935, Italy invaded Abyssinia, the country now called Ethiopia. The British opposed the invasion, and for a time there appeared to be a real danger of war in the Mediterranean. In that year, Lieutenant Gino Birondelli was based in the port of La Spezia.
In particular, in 1935, when Italy declared war to Abyssinia, I was on submarines. And we foresaw that sooner or later there would be a war between Italy and England, because in order to have access to Europe as freely as we wanted, we would have to eliminate the English fleet from the Mediterranean. To eliminate a British fleet from the Mediterranean was a big, big job. And we were not in the position to doing it by the building of more battleships, because to build a battleship takes a lot of money, a lot of time.
The British Navy was the largest and most powerful in the world. Birondelli was right. Anyone wanting to control the Mediterranean in time of war would have to defeat the British Royal Navy. The solution was to create a special weapon. They referred to it as the maiale. In Italian, maiale is the word for pig, and maiale became the code word they used for their secret weapon.
So we thought that we had to find a way of reducing the disadvantage that the Italian Navy had with the British fleet by inventing, by thinking about something which you could build quickly and without too much money. And it was at that point that the maiale business, let's call it, came into being. For instance, at that time, on the summers in La Spezia, there was with me Tesei, Toschi, Franzini, and others. And Tesei and Toschi came up with the idea of building a replica of the weapon used by other Italian naval officers in the First World War to attack the Austrian battleships.
The submariners developed the new weapon in secret and without seeking official approval, exactly the same as Major Rossetti and the original in 1918.
Then Toschi, Tesei, who were naval engineers, started building the small submarine. It was easy because the idea of a submarine, they had it because we were on board submarines. The only point was to make a little one. This was not conceived by engineers in a shipyard or in a naval headquarters. It was conceived by 4 young lieutenants having dinner in a restaurant and talking about the future.
One of the inventors, Elios Toschi, described it. The new weapon was in size and shape very similar to a torpedo, but was in reality more like a miniature submarine. Its features were entirely novel, propulsion being wholly electrical and the steering wheel similar to that of an aeroplane. The crew remained outside the structure, the 2 men barely protected from the onrushing water by a curved screen. They would be able to operate in the interior of a harbour till they found the keel of a large ship and fasten the charge and thus ensure that a large explosion would sink it. At night and under cover of darkness and steering by luminous instruments, they will be able to aim at and attack their objective while remaining quite invisible to the enemy. But to achieve this, the engineers needed another crucial piece of equipment, the underwater rebreather, which produces no air bubbles and enables the human torpedo to remain invisible. Remarkably, there had been several patents registered for a rebreathing device in the 19th century. But it was only in 1878 that an Englishman, Henry Fluss, manufactured his version, which was used in rescuing coal miners trapped by flooded chambers. Then another engineer, Sir Robert Davis, adapted the Fluss system to create the Davis submerged escape apparatus to help sailors escape from their submarine when trapped underwater.
The rebreather really came out of a very small one used on British submarines for the escape in case of some mishap. Commander Belloni was at that time looking after the escape possibilities of Italian submarines. And he had in his hands the British Davis breathing apparatus, which was very little, very small, and would be used only to get out from the submarine, going to the surface, 50, 60, 100 meters. Well, the rebreather was the key to the construction, to the conception and realization of a new weapon. Without the rebreather, it would have been impossible to do what we did.
The development of the new weapon was taking place in secret, and it needed a secret name to go with it. The conspirators called it maiale, which means pig in Italian. It has long been thought that it was because the machine was difficult to control, but Admiral Birondelli can reveal that the real reason for the name was much simpler.
Very often people ask, why did you call it maiale? There was for no reason at all except the secrecy. Because the real potentiality of the weapon we had invented was that it was not to be seen, not to be discovered. It was a secret weapon, and everything about it must be secret. So because we had sometimes the need to speak about it over the telephone and so on, instead of having a code, we would say, the pig, the pig, the pig.
Working in secret, Teseo Tesei and Elios Toschi had managed to build a prototype underwater human torpedo in 1935. But it lay unused for the next 4 years, until war once again reared its ugly head. Tragically, only one of them would survive the conflict. La Spezia. In 1940, it was the centre of operations for the Italian Navy. For over 3 years, the original human torpedo, built by 2 submariners, had lain forgotten. But 20 years after the carnage of the First World War, from which the nations of Europe had still not fully recovered, a Second World War was about to begin.
So when in 1939, when Germany declared war to Poland, and Italy had made an alliance with Germany, and so we knew that we would get into war, we thought that we had to get the old maiale out of the place where it was put to rest and to improve. So in June 40, Mussolini decided to enter the war unprepared. The nation was unprepared to fight that war. We were not up to the standard of the Germans or the British or the Americans or the French. We felt like we would like to be like them. We were not.
The war started badly for Italy. By the end of June, 20 days into the war, the British Navy had sunk 10 Italian submarines. On the 9th of July, in an engagement with ships of the British fleet, the Italian battleship Giulio Cesare was severely damaged. The Italians badly needed to fight back, and the Maiale was made ready for its first operation.
We thought that we should attack the enemy just at the beginning of the war in order to have technical surprise. We were not ready on the 10th of June, and that's why our operation started in August.
The Italian army controlled Libya, and with the French surrender on the 22nd of June 1940, Italy effectively controlled the coast of North Africa all the way to the Egyptian border and the defensive lines of the British 8th Army. The coast of Libya was to be a staging post for the first human torpedo attack against the British fleet anchored in Alexandria. The method of transportation for the human torpedoes were purpose-built canisters on the deck of a submarine. On that first real operation were the inventors, Tesei and Toschi, with Gino Birondelli in charge.
The operation was organized in such a way that the submarine, which was supposed to carry us to Alexandria, went to Bomba Bay near Tobruk alone. We had practically finished putting the Maiale on board the submarine, and we started moving to go out at sea to make this immersion. While we were getting out of the Bomba Bay, a group of 3 swordfish attacked us. One of them dropped his torpedo. Torpedo struck the submarine sank. Only the people who were on the bridge of the submarine survived.
Luckily, Birondelli was one of those on the bridge. The Italian divers managed to recover the Maiale from the shallow waters of the bay, but 50 men had died. It was a bad start, but worse was to follow for the special forces of the Decima Flottiglia Mass. 1 month later, in September 1940, another attack was planned on Alexandria. The submarine Gondar, with 3 human torpedoes in its capsules, reached Alexandria on the 29th. But it had been detected, and for the next 12 hours came under relentless depth charging from a destroyer, until finally, at 8:30 in the morning and nearly out of air, her ballast tanks were blown and she surfaced one final time for the crew to abandon her before she sank to the bottom. Amongst those captured was Elios Toschi, the joint inventor of Italy's top-secret human torpedo. In 1 month, the Maiale operations had lost 2 submarines, 100 men killed or captured, and 8 trained Maiale operators now prisoners of war. Undeterred, the Italian Special Forces tried again on the 21st of October 1940. The submarine Sire left the harbour at La Spezia en route to a new target, Gibraltar. The chief operators were Teseo Tesei, Luigi de la Pen, and once more Gino Birondelli. Gibraltar was the most heavily defended harbour in the Mediterranean. In charge of the submarine was Prince Valerio Borghese, who could trace his ancestors back to 1513 and claim 1 pope and several cardinals amongst them.
While we were moving toward the Bay of Gibraltar, a British destroyer discovered us. We went into immersion very rapidly, and then started the long night of the chase, because destroyers had an apparatus, ASDIC, to detect the submarine. And we spent all the night trying to escape from the ASDIC of that destroyer. That's why when sunrise was near, Borghese made a last attempt. And with a very brilliant maneuver, he was able to drop the destroyer.
It was 2 more full days of manoeuvring, while constantly avoiding enemy vessels, before Borghese was able to finally slip the submarine into the Bay of Gibraltar on the 29th and release the 3 pigs to attack the harbour.
Gibraltar was visible, the harbour, and the naval shipyard was dark, but the town was lighted. So to go toward Gibraltar was very easy. The maiale was like this. So my head was out of the water. The second man was underwater. We went through this long line of merchant ships. Nobody saw us. Nobody saw me. So I decided to go over the booms. And again, there were the sentries, 50 meters to the right, 50 meters to the left. I saw them. They didn't see me. So I said, well, I'll carry on. I'll carry on. And in the dark, I saw the big shape of my target, the Barham.
Birindelli's second man had been underwater during the journey and ran out of oxygen, so he swam to the docks, leaving Birindelli alone on the maiale on the bottom of the harbour floor and moving towards the battleship. But soon, the maiale stopped moving altogether.
I come to the surface, and I saw that the Barham was 50 meters from me. Would you stop doing something if you are 50 meters from your target after you have come from La Spezia and all this stuff? He said, oh, no, I'll get it.
Birindelli pushed and pulled as hard as he could, but the rebreather could not cope with the increased physical effort.
At a certain moment, I felt that I was fainting. And I said, well, once I faint, what's going to happen to the maiale? They will get it, the British. So I put on the timer for the explosion to happen.
Birindelli was captured, and although his maiale exploded, it was still 50 meters from the target and did no damage. The other 2 human torpedoes malfunctioned and did not get into the British base. Tesei managed to coax his damaged machine to the Spanish coast. To safeguard the secret from prying eyes, he set it off out to the open sea, but unfortunately it returned to beach itself, where the British were able to photograph it, giving them the first glimpse of this brand new weapon before the Spanish removed it. So far, the maiale operations had achieved very little, and the next operation would again prove to be a disaster. The Italians called it the glorious failure. The target of the operation this time was Malta, which was proving to be a vital part of the fight against the Italian army in North Africa. The small island of Malta is only 17 miles long, but in 1941 it had 3 airfields, a submarine base, and Grand Harbour, a refuge for the British Mediterranean fleet, and the ability to seriously interrupt supplies to the Axis forces on the North African coast, despite 20 air raids a day against it, giving Malta the unwanted accolade of being the most bombed country in the world. The attack would involve 2 maiale transported on motor torpedo boats to get them close to Malta and backed up by another Italian secret weapon used by the Decima Flottiglia Mass, the explosive boat.
And explosive boats are boats about 15 feet long. And at the stern, there was 1 pilot. And in the bows, there was an explosive bomb with about 300 kilograms of explosives.
On the 25th of July 1941, 9 of these boats with exploding charges were launched close to the Maltese harbour entrance. They were accompanied by 2 human torpedoes, one commanded by its inventor, Teseo Tesei, the second by Lieutenant Francesco Costa. The target was a recently arrived Allied convoy.
The scope of this attack was to place explosive boats inside Valletta Harbour to attack shipping in the harbour. The entrance of Valletta Harbour was blocked by 3 sets of booms. But the Italians did not worry about this because they wanted to enter harbour in a different way. Because the breakwater did not reach all the way to Valletta shore. It stopped about 15 meters short. And over this gap, there was a bridge supported in the middle by a pillar. And from this bridge, there was a steel net which hung down to the seabed. Now, the Italian plan was for a human torpedo to place its warhead against this net and exploded it so that the net was destroyed. And then the explosive boats would enter harbour under the bridge through this hole and attack the shipping.
But the mission would prove to be a catastrophe. The plan would go disastrously wrong, and this operation would provide the British with an opportunity to get their hands on some of Italy's top secret weapons. July 1941, and the Italians have launched a night attack against the island fortress of Malta. A human torpedo, piloted by Teseo Tesei, is sent to blow up one of the nets blocking the entrance to allow explosive boats to enter the harbour.
So their plan was based on absolute surprise. And that is why they used a human torpedo, so that the defenders will know nothing that was happening until there was this first explosion under the bridge. Now the one that was going to blow up the net under the bridge, Tesei, was supposed to explode the bomb at 4:30. But 4:30 came and there was no explosion. So Giobbe, who was in charge of the attack, allowed him another 10 minutes in case it had been delayed. The minutes passed and still no explosion. So now the Italians' went on what one might call Plan B.
The backup plan was to send explosive boats to destroy the net. These were not suicide missions. The pilot leapt from the boat before it reached the target. The first one to make the attempt failed to explode.
So the boat remained stuck to the net with the propellers turning, but the boat stopped there. Meanwhile, the other pilot, his name was Carabelli, when he saw what happened, he decided to attack himself. And he was determined that he would not fail. So he did not jump from the boat. He remained on the boat and drove it straight at the side of the pillar which supported the bridge. The boat hit the pillar and exploded, and Carabelli died.
For this act of extraordinary heroism, Aristide Carabelli was awarded Italy's highest military honour, the Gold Medal for Valour. Unfortunately, his sacrifice was in vain.
So the effect of 2 bombs exploding under the bridge on the surface of the water was that half the span of the bridge was lifted from its foundation and it fell in the water. So that now the entrance to Valletta Harbour was blocked even more than it had been before.
The harbour defences, alerted by the explosions, now began firing at the boats.
The barrage lasted about 1 minute, because after that there were no more targets to fire at.
Worse was to follow for the men of the Decima Flotilla Mass. RAF aircraft attacked the remaining ships, and not one supporting vessel was left unharmed. The few men that survived swam to the shore and were captured. Teseo Tesei was not amongst them, and his body would never be recovered. The Italians called it the glorious failure. It was, however, followed by a glorious success. As a submarine commander, Prince Valerio Borghese seemed to have the uncanny ability to manoeuvre his vessel close to heavily defended British harbours. On the evening of the 19th of September 1941, the Sire, under Borghese's command, once again entered Gibraltar Bay. It made its way slowly to the release point of another 3 human torpedoes for an attack on Gibraltar. The defences in Gibraltar Harbour had been upgraded since the first assault, because naval intelligence now knew of the possibility of an underwater attack. Lieutenant Lionel Crabb was put in charge of underwater defences. There was a constant patrol of boats in the bay, and small depth charges were dropped at frequent intervals as a deterrent to underwater operations.
Dropping small explosive charges was one rather nasty method, because the human frame is pretty soft-shelled, and if you drop a 2-pound charge of anywhere near enough to you, it would certainly incapacitate you if it didn't knock your head off.
Despite these defences, all 3 human torpedoes successfully set their explosives. The tankers, the Fiona Shell and the Denbydale were sunk, and the steamer, the 11,000-ton Durham, was damaged and beached. All 6 of the Maiale crews made it to the Spanish coast opposite Gibraltar and escaped back to Italy. It was a great success, and an even greater one was to follow almost immediately. On the 3rd of December 1941, Captain Borghese in the Sire left La Spezia with another 3 human torpedoes on board. The target this time were 2 British battleships in Alexandria harbour, and on the night of the 18th of December, the Sire released the pigs near the harbour entrance. At 3:30 a.m, Luigi della Pen succeeded in navigating his pig under the Valiant. Though in an act reminiscent of Birindelli in Gibraltar, the last few metres had only been achieved by pulling it along the bottom before he set the timer on the charges. But on rising to the surface, he was seen, picked up, and along with his second man taken aboard the ship, interrogated, but refused to say anything. At 6 a.m, the charge exploded underneath them. Some 15 minutes later, another explosion took place under the battleship the Queen Elizabeth, with the commander of the British Mediterranean Fleet, Admiral Cunningham, on board. The third pig attached its charge to a large tanker, the Sagona, which was moored alongside the destroyer HMS Jervis. They were both severely damaged. It was a total victory for the Italians. Admiral Cunningham wrote, "One could not but admire the cold-blooded bravery and enterprise of the Italians." British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote, "Please report what is being done to emulate the exploits of the Italians in Alexandria harbour and similar methods of this kind." The British were now beginning to understand the huge potential of this weapon.
Now, the human torpedo of Costa, which had been scuttled near Pembroke, was salvaged by the British the next day.
For the first time, the British now had their hands on 3 of Italy's secret weapons: the human torpedo, the explosive boat, and the rebreather. The British Navy were discovering just how ingenious the Italian Special Forces had been.
Divers recovered some of the weapons that had been left by the Italians in earlier raids. They brought the machines back here and we copied it. And so men were then asked to volunteer for special services. And it was at this time that my father saw the notice. He was on North Atlantic convoys at the time, and he thought, this must be for me.
I volunteered for special service in Gibraltar in 1940. And it wasn't until April, May 42 when they grabbed me into the net as a volunteer for special service.
The British had copied the design of the Italian human torpedo, which they called a chariot, and with their version of the rebreather, they underwent intensive training in a Scottish lake. Human torpedoes require a crew of 2, and during the intensive training, Len Berry was partnered with Lieutenant Jeff Larkin.
And you became familiar with the machine moderately well. And I say, given the time in Valour, I think we probably were as well trained as we'd expect to be.
But it's rather frightening because you're sailing in this tank and the gradually the water level's coming up like this, and it comes over your mouth and nose, and one or two people stop breathing because you've completely out of your element. And then one day we all assembled down on the jetty and we were introduced to this human torpedo. and we were given a brief lecture as to what it was all about. Well, you can drop out if you don't want to carry on.
Once the operators were trained, the first attacks began. The British Navy also adopted the same transportation method for their chariots as the Italians had done, in tubes on submarines.
And the first one, Jeff, that I went on, first off, Operation Principle, Jeff and I were engaged in going to Sicily against Palermo. We launched 2 pairs from Thunderbolt, which is the ex-Thetis.
It was the first successful British mission. They attacked Palermo harbour. Submarine again dropped them outside. They went into Palermo harbour, and Dick Greenland successfully put a charge under a cruiser.
That cruiser, the Ulpioltriano, brand new out of the dockyard, sank, and a troop carrier, the Viminale, was badly damaged. The Italians hit back in an entirely novel way. The Italian steamer, the Altera, was laid up in the neutral Spanish waters of Gibraltar Bay. It was moored to a pier in the harbour to be refitted, where it was secretly taken over by the Italian Navy and used as a base for attacks on British ships just 5 kilometres away. A hole was cut into the hull under the water, connecting to a flooded compartment. Maiale were then assembled inside the ship. On the 8th of December 1942, the officer in charge of the Altera project, Lieutenant Visentini, led 3 maiali out of the underwater hatch to attack a large naval force in Gibraltar harbour, including 2 aircraft carriers, Furious and Formidable, and the battleship, Nelson. Only Visentini's maiali was to get through the reinforced defences into the harbour, but he and his second were spotted before they could lay their explosives, and both were killed by depth charges. As a sign of respect for their courage, they were buried at sea by the British some days later with full military honours. Leading the memorial service was Lieutenant Lionel Buster Crabbe, the officer in charge of the underwater security for Gibraltar, whose defensive measures had been directly responsible for causing their death. The Decima Flottiglia Mass were not to be deterred, however. On the 8th of May 1943, 4 merchant vessels were attacked by maiali launched from the Altera. On the 4th of August, 2 more. All were badly damaged. The British had no idea where the attacks originated, although by now Buster Crabbe was having grave doubts about the Altera. But before he could act on it, on the 8th of September 1943, the Italian government announced an armistice and an end to the war with Great Britain. Italy was split in 2. The Allied armies were slowly fighting their way up from the south of Italy, but the Germans still controlled the north. And in June 1944, one of the strangest human torpedo operations was to take place. Former enemies, who weeks earlier were attempting to kill each other, now found themselves on the same side. After nearly 2 years in a British prisoner of war camp, Luigi della Pen, the successful leader of the Italian maiali attack on the British battleship the Valiant, was freed and taken back to Italy to help lead a raid by British human torpedoes against his own ships in German-controlled Italy. In one of the most extraordinary moments of the war, the Decima Flottiglia Mass and the British Royal Navy were to combine operations. De la Pen had fought with the Germans. Now he was to fight with the British. It was, for him, a very strange war indeed. In 1943, the British and Americans were fighting their way up through Italy, but the Germans still controlled the north of Italy, including the part of the Italian Mediterranean fleet still in La Spezia.
Well, the next British raid was rather strange in that the Italians were used. Now, you have to bear in mind that the armistice came about in 1943. And it was at that time that my father was sent out to Italy, combining the Italian naval group with his own naval group. The British Navy were rather concerned that the Germans would be using the Italian ships that were in the Spezia harbour. The Italians were used to put the mission onto the target. They knew the Spezia harbour, they knew all about it, and Della Pen was used. He took the destroyer and the men outside La Spezia harbour and dropped off the torpedoes and the 4 men, and the attack started.
And that I was launched from an Italian motor torpedo boat. When I went into La Spezia in Italy, I was overdressed because you had the variation between January and June. And working on the machine, I was perspiring and I kept misting up. Well, you know what that's, in a complete suit. And I was driving with open visor, because luckily we had the visors which opened at that time, and I was driving that way.
Unfortunately, Len Berry's chariot broke down at the last moment, and he aborted his attack. But his colleague, Malcolm Causer, managed to infiltrate the German defences and place his explosive charge under the Italian cruiser, the Bolzano. The massive explosion under the ship caused it to sink the next morning. This was the last human torpedo operation in Europe. They had run out of targets. The Decima Flottiglia Mass were the first special naval forces in the world, and their successors are still based in La Spezia. The Comando Raggruppamento Subacquei ed Incursori, Teseo Tesei, proudly carry his name. Tesei's death has long been shrouded in mystery. The Italians have always believed that he was killed trying to blast his way into Malta's Grand Harbour. Maltese naval historian Joseph Caruana, who has extensively researched this attack, believes he has the answer to the riddle of what actually happened to him.
The one piloted by Tesei, who was supposed to explode his bomb against the net in the bridge, this one effectively vanished. But the following morning, among the wreckage outside Valletta harbour, they found a breathing mask which must have belonged to Tesei or his companion Pedretti. That is because the crew of the other human torpedo both survived. Now, looking at the records, it was found that shortly at the beginning of the attack, a gunner named Zammit on gun G, when there was the explosion, he went looking out at sea, and in the very, very little amount of light provided by the dawn, the approaching dawn, he saw some movement. He was not sure what it was, but he lined up his gun and fired at it. And he said the target blew up. Now, this target could have been nothing else except Tesei, because there was nobody else in that area. And this was confirmed 25 years later in March 1966, because an Italian human torpedo was found in the seabed near Dragot Point. This could have belonged only to Tesei.
The warhead on the maiale found in 1966 was still intact and was considered to be in a dangerous, unstable condition. The human torpedo was taken out to deep water by the British Navy and blown up. But Tesei's legacy does not end there. The divers of Komsubin still use a modern version of the rebreather in their operations to get close to objectives without being observed. Their weapons too have improved. They carry guns and explosives that will work even after being submerged in water. Tesei and Toschi's vision continues to this day. The Komsubin have a modern version of the maiale, and it remains top secret. This is the World War II Wall of Valour at their headquarters, and underneath is Teseo Tesei's actual maiale, the very same one photographed by the British when it was used in the first raid on Gibraltar in 1940. a proud heritage. And what of Elias Toschi, the other inventor of the maiale? After being rescued from the submarine the Gondar, he was taken to a prisoner of war camp in India. He made 8 unsuccessful attempts at escaping, but on the 9th attempt, he managed to evade capture dressed as a Pathan tribesman, eventually reaching neutral Portuguese territory. Gino Birindelli stayed in the Navy after the war, rising to the rank of Admiral, and eventually attaining the distinguished rank of Commander of the NATO naval forces in the Mediterranean. All this despite developing tuberculosis and only having one lung due to his exertions with rebreathing experiments. Luigi Duran de la Pen also remained in the Navy. In 1945, he was presented with his gold medal for valour for his successful attack on the Valiant. In 1942, Prince Valerio Borghese left the submarine Sire to take command of the Decima Flotilla Mass. In recognition of their gallantry in extremely dangerous operations, the entire crew were given the opportunity to take up other, safer naval posts, but declined and remained on board. The Sire was sunk by depth charges in August 1942. There were no survivors. Borghese was in the north of Italy at the armistice in 1943 and continued fighting with the Germans till the end of the war. Upon his death in August 1974, he was buried in Santa Maria Maggiore in the Vatican, close to his ancestor, Pope Paul V. Lieutenant Commander Lionel Buster Crabbe, while working for the British Secret Service, disappeared on the night of the 19th of April 1956 while diving on and investigating the hull of a Soviet cruiser moored in Portsmouth Harbour. Over a year later, a body was discovered in a frogman's suit. It had no head or hands, but was assumed to be Buster Crabbe. Despite many theories, his death remains a mystery. Ironically, it was another death, that of Robert Hobson's father, that set him on the voyage of discovery into the history of the human torpedoes, and he was determined to honour their memory. He organised the rebuilding from original plans of a brand new Mark I British chariot, and then something remarkable happened.
It was about halfway through the building of the Mark I that we happened to pop into a scrap dealer's down in Portsmouth, and we found a human torpedo, an original. But this, I'm pleased to say, wasn't a Mark I, it was the Mark II.
The Mark II was an improved British chariot. In this version, the men sat inside the machine, making the chariot more manoeuvrable. Its underwater speed was increased, it had a range of 48 kilometres, and a much larger warhead. The Mark II was used for the first and last time in a mission on the other side of the world against Japanese ships in Phuket Harbour.
Again, a submarine dropped the chariots with the 4 operators outside the harbour, and they went in and blew up a couple of small Japanese boats. They were the first charioteers to actually turn their torpedo round and come back out and meet the submarine. And so that was perhaps the first successful raid which had been completed in every way.
50 years after their outstanding operation in Phuket Harbour, Petty Officers Bill Smith and Sid Wilcott were once again reunited with the machine that earned them both the Distinguished Service Medal for their bravery. In 1991, in La Spezia, a memorial was unveiled in memory of the wartime heroes of the Decima Flottiglia Mass. In 1993, Robert Hobson organised a similar memorial at Loch Cairnborne to honour the bravery of the British human torpedoes. In 1941, Tesei and Toschi's invention, the human torpedo, had sunk 2 British battleships, severely reducing British superiority and almost turning the Battle of the Mediterranean in favour of the Italian Navy. Their courage and imagination could have changed the outcome of the Second World War.